So good evening, everyone. We'll make a start. And it's an absolute pleasure this evening to be speaking with Dr. Susan Rogers. So Susan holds a doctorate in psychology from McGill University, where she studied music in cognition and psychoacoustics. Her research focuses on auditory memory, the perception of musical signals, and the influence of musical training on auditory development. For 2 decades prior to her science career, Rogers was one of the world's few women who known for her work as a record producer, an engineer, mixer, and audio electronics technician. And her career highlights included being a staff engineer for Prince, a relationship that would change her life and give her the opportunity to work on albums such as Purple Rain, Around the World in a Day, Parade, Sign of the Times, and the infamous Black Album. She's also worked with other artists such as Barenaked Ladies, David Byrne, Tricky, and Tevin Campbell. And her recent book, this is what it sounds like, What the Music You Love Says About You, explores the theories of why you fall in love with music. And this evening, we'll be discussing the intricacies of listening, becoming a producer, and her memories of working with Prince. So good evening and welcome, and thank you for joining us at the Huddersfield Literature Festival.
Hello, everybody, and hello, Hardeep. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this, and I look forward to our conversation. We've got a lot of mutual interests.
I have to thank you, first of all. I loved reading your book. It's so thought-provoking, and it also kind of helped me reaffirm ideas that, you know, sometimes kind of come in and out of your head when working with either music students or dancers. You know, those things that I've often explored in my own mind, and you've, you know, very articulately put it all together with all the research that you've done. So yeah, superb. As well as having the website that directs you to the songs was, you know, phenomenal. So thank you very much for inviting me to listen to artists I already knew with a kind of an analytical sense, and introducing me to so many more artists. You know, I think it's just the best way to read a book. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I was doing an interview yesterday with a radio station in Massachusetts, and the interviewer said something that I'm really happy to hear. He said, "Your book raises more questions than I ever knew I had." And I thought, wow, that's great, because if you're a scientist, that's actually what you hope to do. Anytime you are describing something about what we know based on evidence, based on empirical research reports, you realize that the next thing it does is, if you've done your job properly, it makes you think, oh, so if that's that, then this must be this, or if that's that, then how do you explain this other thing? And certainly this book on music, I would never claim, I don't think anybody else would either, that it's the end all and be all of how music works in our brain. It's a model of music listening, and it describes 7 dimensions of music listening that are available to us whenever we listen to a record. We can analyze a record subliminally on many different levels: melody, lyrics, the sound design, the performances, or whatever. But that's not to say that those are the only 7 that there are. Music listening is incredibly complex. There's a lot more to say about it.
No, that's fantastic, and we'll jump back into that in a short while. If anyone does have any questions, so that, you know, just put them into the Q&A, and, you know, we'll see if we can answer a few of your questions as well. And we've had a few already been sent in as well. So thank you very much to the participants for sending in some of your questions as well. So just kind of step back a little bit. We just wanted to kind of find out a little bit about you, and, you know, if you can just tell us, you know, what part of America you were born and kind of grew up, just where you start.
I grew up in Southern California. I was born there in 1956. So Southern California then still had orange groves and wild spaces and lots of fields and things. I grew up actually right next door to Disneyland, which for a little kid is a great place to be. But Disneyland was built in Anaheim, California in the 50s, and our tract of homes was right next door. So grew up with that fantasy world made reality then, and then moved to Minnesota when I went to work for Prince. Since then, I've lived in Montreal, in Canada, but right now I'm currently living in New York State and lived in a few different places.
And tell us a little bit about the soundscape you had in your house growing up. So what kind of music was being played?
Yeah, now in Southern California in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we had a lot of radio stations to choose from, which wasn't the case throughout most of the United States. In rural areas of the United States, you might get one radio station and you'd listen to whatever they played. This is what people told me about growing up out in the hinterlands. But where I grew up in Southern California, you had really great AM radio, which played all the pop stuff, but pop radio in the 60s included James Brown and Sly Stone, and included Stevie Wonder, and included a lot of cool stuff. It wasn't just the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Who and Motown. It was a variety of music. So that was really nice. And all you had to do was turn the dial and you could find jazz or classical or the more eclectic stuff. I found out later that what a great advantage that was for me, being exposed to a lot of music.
Excellent. And so tell us about your first kind of recollections of Prince's music in particular.
I can tell you the exact first recollection. So at that time, I think the first time I heard him would have been around late 78 or early 79. And I had a job at a company called Audio Industries Corporation in Hollywood. And what they did was they sold and serviced studio packages, the equipment, the console, the tape machine, the microphones, the speakers, everything you needed. And I was a young technician, an audio trainee, and I was 22, 23 years old. So anyway, I was on a bus, taking the bus to work, and I was sitting near the back, and sitting in the back of this bus was this young kid, and he had a boombox on his lap. And I think he was really high, like his pupils were really dilated, and he had this frozen smile on his face, but he had that boombox, and he was listening to one of the two great R&B radio stations in SoCal, KJLH, KACE. KJLH, by the way, was owned by Stevie Wonder. Anyway, he was listening to one of those stations and the Prince song Soft and Wet came on. And I remember I missed my bus stop because I had to stay on that bus and hear that DJ come on and say who that artist was. It just caught my ear immediately. From that point, I bought Prince's first two albums, became his fan, and bought all of his albums that came out after that.
Wow, superb. And whilst you were kind of taking that music in, what were your kind of friends or family, thinking about Prince's music? Did they have different views or?
Yeah, I was out of the house at that time. I was living with a boyfriend in West Hollywood. We were starting our careers, and his taste in music, well, he loved Frank Zappa and King Crimson, and he loved prog rock, and he loved John McLaughlin and that kind of stuff. So he and we did not have similar tastes in music, except we both liked Frank Zappa, and I liked the R&B soul stuff. So I was my own curator of music. I wasn't part of a social scene that necessarily listened to R&B and soul music. Being a white person, the majority of white people my age tended to listen to rock and alternative music. But I listened almost exclusively to Black artists. It just felt right to me.
Wow, fantastic. And did Prince or any other artist around that time make you question how you wanted to live your life?
No. It's a funny question. I think you're always questioning how you want to live your life, especially when you're young. I think you have a sense of what you want. You have no idea how to get there. You realize that in order to get what you want, there will be sacrifices must be made. And that means giving up some of what you like and stepping into the unknown and maybe taking on some things that you're not sure you can do. But I knew at that early stage nothing mattered more to me than having a career in the music business, than contributing to record making. I didn't know how I could contribute, but making a contribution to help records come into the world was what I wanted more than anything. So to achieve that, I studied electronics and became an audio technician. And it was that work, that study, that preparation that got me my dream job. Because in 1983, Prince was just coming off the 1999 tour, getting ready to do Purple Rain. In fact, he'd already started the Purple Rain album, and he wanted a technician. He told his management, get me someone from New York or LA. He wanted an industry technician. And I just so happened to fill that bill. And on top of that, I was female. He liked working with women. And I had all his records and had seen him live when he came through LA a few times. And he and I listened to the same kind of music. And we could talk about Grand Funk Railroad. We could talk about One Way featuring Al Hudson or Frankie Beverly and Mays. And I knew those records. So it turned out on paper anyway, I was a perfect fit for him.
Brilliant. And so, talking about, actually working with Prince, and so kind of, if you can give us an idea of like I know there's no typical day, but, what a day might entail working with Prince.
That train moved really fast. So every day, even the days that were relatively relaxed, you're on a high wire, because this is a young man, at least in the mid 80s. He was on top of his career at that point, and he was young, had all the energy in the world. 3 or 4 hours of sleep was a full night's sleep to him. So you worked very hard with very little sleep. But a typical day involved either rehearsing at home in Minneapolis or recording, which would be, in those days, we recorded at rehearsal, or we went out to Los Angeles and recorded at Sunset Sound Studios, or we might be on tour, or we might be making a movie, the Purple Rain movie, or Under the Cherry Moon, the things that we did then. We could be making a video, but we could have shows that night. In every case, if Prince was awake after he took care of business calls for the day, he wanted a musical instrument in his hands. So every single day he wanted to be playing at rehearsal, at a show, in the studio, wherever he was. Music is what was happening. As his engineer, my job was to make sure that that signal was flowing and that we could record what he was performing. His creative output at that time was unparalleled. Now, at rehearsal, we'd often do older songs just to warm up the band. So he might riff on Irresistible Bitch or Possessed or any old thing from his catalog, just get the band going. They'd play it for 20, 30 minutes to warm up. And even that was a treat. But he'd do that before launching into new arrangements and new songs.
Okay. And so working with Prince, did he give you the confidence to do things perhaps you wouldn't have done otherwise?
Oh, goodness, yes. Yeah. He had many, many talents, but one of his talents was in seeing potential in people. So imagine, let's use a sports analogy, and let's use gymnastics. An experienced coach will be able to tell where your ceiling is. So let's say there's a young gymnast or several young gymnasts, and they're all performing these certain acts, which get them to point 1, 2, 3 on the ladder. Depending on how well you do 3, it can be an indication of whether you're capable of doing 6. And depending on how well you do 6, it can indicate whether or not you can do 10. So Prince could read people, his musicians and his staff, pretty well. And if we were capable of more and better, he expected us to do more and better right then and right there. So if you were a gymnast who's doing a 3 on some apparatus, no, you're expected the next time you come in to do a 5. Just do the 5. It doesn't matter if you're not prepared for it, just do the damn 5 and figure out how to get there. So because that was his, that's what he projected onto us, he was fairly tolerant of us aiming for a 5 and hitting a 4. He was okay with that. He was okay with not hitting the bar. What he valued was aiming for the bar and going as high as you could. So yeah, it made you courageous. It made you bold. It taught you the value of having confidence and stepping into the fog of the unknown when it came to your own abilities.
And so one of my favorite parts of the book is your interaction with jazz legend Miles Davis. So if you could elaborate on this amazing encounter for the listeners, please.
Yeah, that's a day I will never, ever, ever forget. So the year was 1987. Paisley Park Studios was still under construction. It was almost finished. So we were working, Prince and I would work at his home studio. He lived in the home that he would live in for the rest of his life. It was on Galpin Road in Chanhassen, Minnesota. Nice home. And you'd walk in the front door and you go downstairs, and downstairs in the basement level was this beautiful recording studio. So I got a call from him. I was at home, and he said, Miles is coming over for dinner. Can you come over and pull these tapes? And he gave me some titles to pull out of the vault. So I pulled these tapes and I came to the house and I went straight downstairs, and I was waiting downstairs in the studio for Prince to come down. So Prince was upstairs with Miles and with Prince's dad, John Nelson. Now, Miles and the dad were both about the same age, older jazz musicians, might have been in their 70s at this time, late 60s. So these two gentlemen, Prince comes downstairs after dinner, and the two guys, Miles and John Nelson, come downstairs behind him, and they're having a conversation. And they come down the stairs, and Miles steps right in front of me. I'm standing near the tape machine, but Miles stepped in front of me, and he's standing with his back to me. He's very close to me. I could put my hand on his shoulder if I wanted, but he's very close, but he's got his back to me, and he's facing John Nelson, and they're talking about pants. And they both kind of talk like this, and John Nelson saying to Miles, I like them pants you got. And Miles is saying, what pants? He says, you know, striped pants. And Miles says, oh, striped pants. Yeah, you do. I've seen you. Where you see me in striped pants? I've seen you on TV. Where on TV? At the Grammys. I wasn't on the Grammys with striped pants. So they're going back and forth about whether or not these striped pants exist. I just hurt my throat by doing that. So they're going back and forth about these striped pants. Pardon me 1 second. And all of a sudden, Miles standing right there in front of me, he spins around 180 degrees and he puts his face right in my face. If you've seen pictures of Miles, you know, he had big eyes, really intense looking. He put that face right in front of my face and he said, yes, I do. They're made out of eel, like in Vietnam. And those words were so strange. Those words don't even go together. And I just held my gaze and I stared right back at him and I said, eel, like in Vietnam? He started firing off questions. Who are you? What's your name? Where are you from? What do you do? How long you been here? Blah, 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 blah. So he's there with his face, just holding my gaze. And I'm holding gaze back because my boss, the 5'3" guy in the high heels with the high hair, is sitting right over there. And you'd have to work a lot harder at this point if you wanted to intimidate me. So he's there and I'm there. We're going back and forth, back and forth. And all of a sudden he says, you a musician? And I said, no, I'm not. He said, that's okay. Some of the best musicians I know aren't musicians. And then he just turned around and it was over. And I've thought about that and continued to think about that for years. Some of the best musicians I know, and I heard this from members of his band later on, some of the best musicians are those who have a capacity to think about music and play it as a non-musician might. That means being extremely open-minded. But he also meant some of the best musicians, some of the most musical people are non-musicians. All of us have music in us to a greater or lesser degree. And just because you don't play an instrument or compose or sing, doesn't mean that you're not musical. And there are some musicians, I've seen some at Berklee, certainly not the majority, but some, who are trained musicians. They know music theory, and they're far less musical than I am. They don't connect to it on a deep enough level. Their analysis of music suggests that they're merely analyzing its dimensions. It would be like if you were a chef, you know, a celebrity chef once said to his students, you know how to cook, but do you know how to eat? Likewise, you might know how to make music. Do you know how to listen? Listening is something that's different than just hearing. And I realized in time, it took a long time, but I realized that I was an extremely musical listener, and that was my value in the recording studio.
Brilliant, yeah. I've been using it as a little bit of a mantra over the past few months as well. I think it's absolutely beautiful. So the book also explores how we possess a unique listener profile. And so based on your brain's reaction to certain dimensions of the song. So if you could elaborate on that, please. Thank you.
These are things I learned when I was in grad school, and they made a huge impact on me. So I went to college later in life after I had had 22 years in the music business. So when I was in grad school, I'm taking classes on music perception and cognition, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, that makes sense. Now I understand. So the book is describing a new model of music cognition that's based on research out there in the world and shows what our brains are doing when we listen to melody and lyrics and the rhythm on a record and timbre. Timbre is the sound design. Is this done with electronic instruments or acoustic instruments, drum machine or real drums, percussion or something else? So those are the four musical elements, but we're also evaluating aesthetic dimensions of a record, just like we would movies and television. We're evaluating its novelty versus its familiarity. Some of us have an appetite for groundbreaking art. Some of us have an appetite for traditional art. It's no better or worse, it's just where our appetites lie. Some of us have an appetite for realistic records, those made with traditional acoustic instruments. Some of us have an appetite for the opposite of that, abstract music, music that's made in the box with sound design and features musical instruments that don't physically exist. Just as some of us like realistic movies about real situations with real people, and others like that sci-fi fantasy stuff or animation. Equally good, different. And then the seventh and final dimension is authenticity. Some of us like our music performances to be technically perfect. And that's the thrill we get from someone hitting that high bar and achieving technical perfection. Others of us have an appetite for a lot of soul. I don't mean R&B, funk, I mean music that's expressed with heart, even if it's a bit sloppy and some of those notes are a little bit out of bounds. We listen for a certain kind of authenticity that either comes from above the neck, a very cerebral place, or below the neck, the heart and the hips and the belly button. So on these seven dimensions, we tend to have a sweet spot where music feels perfect for us. When you listen to a given record, you're scanning those dimensions unconsciously, but you're scanning those dimensions, listening for your treats. Where are my treats? Listening for the lyrics. Is this my kind of lyric writing? Is this my kind of groove? If you find a single treat, all it takes is one, you will like that record. If you find more than one treat, that can result in musical love or love at first listen.
Amazing. I mean, I found it super interesting to learn that kind of rhythm is a psychological property. But I kind of knew it in a sense because when I've been teaching like dance students and like, you know, I've been asking them to, you know, to kind of dance to the rhythm or to even clap along to the rhythm. And I'm thinking, how can you not hear that? And it was just it's just really interesting, you know, how you analyze that and you know, I mean, yeah, if you tell us a little bit more about rhythm and that kind of aspect, I think that was really cool.
Yes, it's really interesting to learn that nearly everyone, I mean, really nearly everyone, can keep time with a metronome. If you're in the car and you've got the turn signal going tick, 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 we can move our hands or our feet in time with that. That's not hard. But rhythm is something else. So keeping time with a metronome is simply, well, you're just keeping time. That's beat perception. But rhythm perception is a little bit higher order function. What it demands is that you listen to where all the individual notes are falling in a piece of music, which might involve quarter notes and eighth notes and 16th notes and 32nd notes, a lot of different notes. And what you're doing is you're extracting the whole from all those individual parts, and you are figuring out where you're going to put your body's movements to it. Now, record makers are going to try to build in cues to help you extract the rhythm. So they might make the kick drum long and strong and the snare drum short and softer. That would be bam, tick, bam, tick. Or they do it the other way around. Tick, bam, tick, bam, short, long, weak, strong. All these different combinations can be employed to kind of cue us in as to what would be the best dance that would go with this music. Folks who lack rhythm perception, folks who are said to be beat deaf, there aren't many of them, but it's like tone deafness, some people have it. If you're beat deaf, you can't perform that skill and you can't dance in time. You might be able to start off in time, but you can't stay in time because it's like being, they've compared it to being dyslexic. You see the words, you don't have any problem seeing the words on the page, you have a problem organizing them. Well, I should have said, you don't have a problem seeing the letters on the page, you have a problem organizing them into words and sentences, and you tend to see them reversed and backwards. So yeah, rhythm perception is a skill that most other species don't have. Humans have it, and some parrots have it, but not many others.
And I loved it. And then another aspect is where you refer to John Schwartz's article in the New York Times, and it said about kind of to know me, know my iPod, and that was lovely because over the holidays, I think in December, Spotify sends you this wrapped up, this little gift of all the kind of music you've been listening to over the years. So if you could tell us a little bit more about that, and whether that listener profile stays the same or does it change over time?
That's a beautiful thing. I think that article in the New York Times by John Schwartz came out in 2003, if I'm not mistaken, but it's when iPods were still around. And John, this reporter for the New York Times, described buying a used iPod from a coworker, a guy named Ken. And Ken didn't bother to erase his iPod before he sold it to John. So John had this iPod with all of Ken's music on it. So plugged in his headphones and he listened to Ken's playlist. And he wrote this article that says, I feel like I know Ken better and I like what I know. He said, I never would have guessed that this was the music that Ken was into. That was a really influential article to me because he's describing something that's true of us. Those of us who love music deeply, not everyone does, but a good deal of us do, have self-curated the music that we love. And I like to call that, or what we should be calling it for ourselves, is the music of me. This is the music that represents you. This is the music that you love the most. When you share that with someone else, you're sharing a very private and intimate part of yourself. It's almost like sharing your fantasies. It turns out, science shows us that when we're listening to music we love, we actually do go into our own heads. We shut off the outside world and we go into that place of daydreaming and fantasy. Music facilitates our daydreams and our fantasies. So music listening is an intimate process, sharing your playlist, the music you love most with others through a record pull, which I describe in the book, by describing, here's the music of me. Here's the music that I love more than any others. The groove that feels perfect to my body, the lyric writing that makes me swoon, the melodies, the chord changes, the harmonies, the stylistic choices, the realism or the authenticity. This is the music I love the most. You're sharing down deep inside a private aspect of yourself. It's a generous gesture.
And again, over time, do you think that changes a great deal, or do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So evidence suggests, and there's not a lot of evidence, but what we have suggests that the kind of listener you are, it's pretty stable throughout your life. So in other words, you're going to be listening for the same kinds of treats that you liked in the past. The difference is you're going to find it often in different styles of music. So one study that illustrates this point beautifully was by pardon me, a fellow named Adrian North. And he showed, he's looking at personality profiles and music preferences, he found two groups of listeners that are nearly identical in their personality profiles. Personality profile includes introvert versus extrovert, tendency for depression or conscientiousness or agreeableness, and even things like IQ. Anyway, these two groups, almost identical profiles. One group was young men who liked heavy metal, and the other group was older guys who liked classical. And what that says is these folks are listening for the same sorts of things in music. They want high complexity. They want music with a lot of changes. They don't want your top of the pop stuff. They want music that invites active, not passive listening. Excuse me. Pardon me.
No, that's fine.
My throat gives out. Same type of listening, different style of music, which is commensurate with their age and their social scene. When you're young, you listen to heavy metal. When you get older, you want that thrill, but a 57-year-old guy is not going to want to listen to heavy metal as much as he did when he was young. He'll find classical, and he'll get the same rewards, the same treats from a different type of music.
So as my kind of art educator role, I've looked in the past and explored things like liminality and those spaces where creativity takes place. And again, you've touched on it briefly about daydreaming. I think you refer to it as mind wandering network. Mm-hmm. So if you can talk about that and like maybe how it forms, part of that identity or that self, that'd be interesting. Yeah.
Well, that's a hot topic in neuroscience right now. It's called the default network. So it turns out that there's a network of interconnected nuclei in our brains, and nuclei are just specialized structures. So there are these structures, nucleus accumbens and the insula and the caudate nucleus, and these things that are connected to one another. Collectively, they form or are responsible for our sense of self. Whenever we are thinking about ourselves, self-awareness, self-consciousness, self-image, these things are doing the work. So the human brain is constantly going back and forth between focusing on the outside world and then going into its own head. And we do that 30 to 50% of the time, according to current research. We're always going back and forth, in and out. So this default network lights up quite a lot, 30 to 50% of the time during the day. Studies show that when we listen to our favorite music, it's one of the quickest way of all art forms. It's one of the quickest ways to turn on that default network. So what that means is that music truly is serving as a vehicle for our daydreams. Our daydreams and fantasies are actually the genesis, the godhead of creativity. Creativity, the process of thinking of something new, whether it's a dance or a song or fashion or whatever, begins with mind wandering and going into your own head and activating those daydreaming circuits, letting them go wherever they want to go, taking your brain off its leash, let it wander, don't give it anything to play with, let it play in its own garden. And that's often when creative ideas flow, which is why for many people, they get their most creative ideas in the shower or the bathtub, or taking a long walk, driving in their car with the radio turned off, just in complete silence. We need to let our brain off of its leash so that it can go to those places it wants to go to, and is often stopped from going to those places because we've always got a screen or something in front of us. Daydreaming is very valuable to our brains.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. It is, and again, if you're working with students and they end up daydreaming, just they're dealing with things or processing things, and using creativity in different forms. I think it's really special.
You just reminded me. I've been on a Vladimir Nabokov kick lately, and I read in his autobiography, Speak Memory. He said something really beautiful. He's amazing. And he writes about being a child and how little children do get lost in their own heads and staring at objects. They just get in a trance almost.
Love
And
it.
he wrote, never, ever tell a child to hurry up. That just got me. I thought that was so beautiful because I could so relate to that. When that child is going into his or her own head, there's important stuff going on there. It may look on the outside like they're just zoning out. Mm-mm. If they're zoning out, it doesn't mean that this is being very, very active. And the important thing is it's activating their sense of self. And
Yeah.
everyone wants their child to have a strong sense of self, of knowing who you are.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Prince as well. So if one of my favorite songs is The Beautiful Ones, and towards the end, when he's actually screaming out the lyrics, is it important to understand what he's saying or not? And you talk a little bit about, lyrics in a bit, and the emotional space inside your consciousness and rationality, things like that. So when my son, he's listening to Punjabi music, or, that connection's there, but it doesn't really, you don't really have to understand the lyrics as such.
It's very true. So I mentioned these 7 dimensions of music listening, and when we're listening to a record, it comes in through our ears and up through our cochlea, our organ of hearing, and it goes up into the brain. And quite early on, it splits off. The signal is sent to multiple areas of our brain. So we can independently focus on the lyrics. For most of us, it's over here on the left, or the melody over here on the right, or the rhythm is kind of up top here, or the style, which is in the front. We can visualize things, that's back there in the occipital lobe. So it's very true when people will tell you sometimes, oh, I never listened to the lyrics. Believe them when they say that. It means that that is not where they're finding their treats. And when they listen to a record, they're going right for those elements that give them the biggest reward. And by reward, I mean a release of dopamine. So it is not absolutely necessary to understand the words to get a tremendous amount of satisfaction from a record. The vocal performance is carrying simultaneously 2 types of signals. One is the information, which is the text, the lyrics, and the other is the subtext, the intonation, the feeling coming from that performer's heart. We can get a lot of enjoyment just from that feeling, just from that delivery and the intonation. I certainly have records in my collection that are sung in Spanish and Portuguese and Japanese and languages that I don't speak. And I love those records and have loved them for years, not knowing, I have no idea what they're saying, but I know what I feel when I hear those records.
Yeah, excellent. There's also some research about, what makes people, the successes. And it suggested that elite athletes at the highest level sometimes usually have 3 things in common. One being how active they were as a child. The second is, that they wanted to please someone in their life, whether it was a coach or a parent, and, working hard for their approval. And then thirdly, I think it was a certain level of trauma, illness, divorce, bereavement, something that happened in their lives that gives them that determination to overcome them hurdles and develop grit and determination. If this is true, I think, obviously in many fields, so how true do you think this was, either for yourself or Prince?
Oh, certainly true for Prince. Now, musicians aren't as active as athletes, obviously, because musicians have to spend hours kind of locked to that musical instrument and just playing over and over again. So you're active with your fingers, but not necessarily the whole body. But yeah, Prince, I'm told as a child, rehearsed constantly. He was a fiend for practicing and rehearsing, which is what made him so adept on so many instruments as he got older. It's also well established, this has been written about publicly, that Prince had an abusive childhood. His parents divorced, his mother remarried, his stepfather and his mother were not very nice to him. They treated him pretty badly. So when there's that trauma in your youth, the pressure of that pulls you back like a slingshot, so that when you finally get to escape and you get your big break, signed to a team or signed to a record deal, you can achieve escape velocity. The pressure in his life was so great that it launched him for most of his life, most of his career. In my own life, there were difficulties. My mother had a long illness when I was a child, passed away when I was 14. I was cooking and cleaning and kind of being I'm the only girl in the family, so I was being the domestic from the age of 11 onward, and there was certainly no money in our family, so college was absolutely not an option. So all of that, those sorts of pressures pull you back, so that when you get your break, you take off and you don't look back, because you are aware of how fortunate you are to have escaped that sphere in which you grew up. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know a great deal about Prince, can you describe The Vault? And are you excited to hear something from that hasn't already been released?
Oh, goodness. So when I joined Prince in '83, his tapes they were just kind of scattered. They weren't organized anywhere. They were at his home in Minnesota, and they were out at Sunset Sound Studio, and even some other studios in Minneapolis where he had done his early recording. So the first order of business was to gather everything, all of his tapes, into one place and catalog them, so we knew what he had and where it physically was located. As the Paisley Park studio complex became a reality, the designs on paper included a vault, a proper bank vault. The door of the vault at Paisley it's a bank vault. So it's like a foot thick, and it's got one of those big round wheels on the front and a very complicated keypad system for gaining entry to it. Inside the vault were just floor to ceiling shelves, rows of shelves with all of his tapes on there. Prince was so prolific that, as I understand it, I left him in '87, but as I understand it, in the early '90s, they could no longer shut the door to the vault because tapes were literally just spilling out of it. There was no room. So yeah, he was extremely prolific. And in the days of analog tape, your work existed on these big reels. Later on, it existed on hard drives, but yeah, he was tremendously prolific. As far as what's in there now that hasn't been heard, I don't know. I used to think when he passed away, I thought that there was a lot that hadn't been heard. And then I found out what the bootleggers and the illegal collectors had actually amassed. And it turns out Prince was a bit sloppy with his cassettes, and they'd end up just all over the place, and people could pick them up and find them and copy them and disseminate them. So a lot of it has been heard in a really low quality form.
Underground, yeah.
But there's still gems in there that haven't been remixed, that haven't been released. It's a tough problem to solve, because you have to decide who gets the money for it, who was the record label that he was signed to when he made that recording, and of his estate he left no heirs. So where does the money go? It's a difficult problem.
And then some of the work I'm doing with like the Prince Reimagine project is thinking about kind of collaborations with other artists, you know, from different genres of kind of world music. You know, was there ever a time where, you know, or you know, if you know there was a time where you think, oh, if this collaboration took place, you know, it'd be just super exciting. You know, any thoughts on those?
You know, Prince didn't collaborate enough. He did. He collaborated with Tevin Campbell and Shaka Khan and quite a lot of different artists. Sheena Easton, of course, there's a big one. Prince was a genius with melody, which means that a lot of the songs he wrote lend themselves to be reinterpreted because those melodies are so gorgeous. In fact, I think the biggest selling single he ever had was Nothing Compares to You, which really found a wider audience when it was covered by Sinead O'Connor. So yeah, people who take Prince songs and reimagine them are likely to make discoveries in there, taking those melodies and treating them without Prince's rhythms, with a different rhythm, let's say, without his vocal style, without depending on how he used his voice and his background vocals to structure the harmony on a record, can find some real gems in there. There are some beauties.
Yeah. And if at times you feel like you want to remember Prince and, to be close, do you have a particular piece of ephemera or object that helps you with this?
I don't think so. He does appear in my dreams, from time to time. I talk about him. I do interviews, and if I'm asked to, I'm always happy to do that. It was it was tremendously fortunate to have known him, to have spent that much time with him, and especially to have been with him during the most fertile creative period of his life, and during that period, be in the studio with him. So I wasn't a girlfriend or a business manager or someone who saw him after hours. I saw him when he was doing the thing he did best, creating. That's when we spent time together. So that's a valuable set of memories. It's a valuable resource for me. It didn't necessarily illuminate how to work with other artists because it was no one quite like Prince. And if you tried to apply Prince's way of thinking and working to other artists, it just wouldn't work. But I would like to do my part to help get the word out there about who he was, how he worked, what it was like being with him, because he deserves it.
Yeah. And then if you were in Prince's shoes and the year is 2023 and you're reflecting back on your career, what changes might you have made in your choices?
Prince, if this were Prince looking back?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if you were in his shoes, as it were, so we know Prince. Well, you tell us, if it's Prince looking back, or if you were in his shoes.
Or imagine that he and I had both passed on and we're not employer anymore. We're just two people in the beyond and we're just having a conversation. If I were to give him some advice, here's what I'd suggest. If you're at the very, very top of your profession, especially if it's in the arts, music or acting or something like that, it is really easy to develop a messiah complex. Now, Prince had a high native intelligence, and he wasn't going to fall for that nonsense, but he did fall into the trap of extending his concept of us past its expiration date. So in other words, he worked his way up to Purple Rain, achieved superstardom, and then the record that came after that, Around the World in a Day, didn't feature him necessarily on the cover. It featured a lot of people on the cover, and in the lyrics of that album, he's singing about an us and a we and a place, and there's us, and that's what I mean by a messiah complex. You see yourself as the leader of a group of people, a movement or something like that. All fair enough if you are actually on top. But Around the World in a Day didn't sell as many copies as Purple Rain. It wasn't nearly as successful. Why would it? You crest that wave. He had a second wave with Sign of the Times, but after that, it's time to recognize that you're now a legacy artist and you don't have as many followers as you once had. So a lot of the lyric content and the drive that he expressed, the desires he expressed on Graffiti Bridge and in records that followed often were assuming that there was this movement behind him. I think he would have been better off to go ahead and play in the trough of that wave, and to go ahead and explore his artistry, deepen his artistry, not worry about followers, and let them come in the fullness of time. This means, this is what most artists do, you got to disappear out of the spotlight for a little bit, and you'll find your groove again and they'll come back. The artists who've been around a long time with success, let's take Elton John and the Rolling Stones just for two examples, they do that. They're okay with watching the glory days disappear and just knowing, having confidence that they'll come back again in a different form later on.
And what do you think he'd say to you?
Oh, tell me I was completely wrong. Tell me I was completely wrong. Yeah, he was so damn smart, and he knew so much, and every conversation with him would be enlightening because that mind was very original. So you'd argue with him about things, but he was tough to argue with because he was a very original thinker and very, very smart.
Yeah. I know you touched on it slightly, but what would you like to see that helps preserve Prince's legacy in the future?
What I hope would happen is for the folks who knew him well to talk about him. Say yes to all these interviews, do as many as you can. Just tell people about him. That's the only way I think that a complete picture of the man will emerge, is when we have all these pixels over the years from so many different perspectives. I knew about his studio life. Other people knew him as his musicians, or people who understood his operations, and people who were his girlfriends and family friends and childhood friends. They all saw a different side of him. So I think that would be the best thing for his legacy. Another thing that I think would help is for the estate to release live videos. Because when you listen to music today, the youth of today tends to think that it's been pitch and time corrected because, today's records are. Watch him live. Watch how good he was as a player on so many different instruments and as a singer live on stage. That's fertile ground for being mightily impressed with him.
And any particular shows that you think just stand out for you?
I don't know what's available out there other than the Sign of the Times concert film with Sheila E. and her band, but that's a good place to start. And any live clips you can find of him out there. That's a good way to get to know Prince. This was some years back, he did, I think it was 20 or 21 sold out nights at the Los Angeles Forum. And that forum holds 14,000 people. And he had the long residency, like 21 nights.
Mm.
And my friend saw 3 of those shows. And my friend, who is a gifted musician himself, said, yeah, there were long stretches in every show, Prince loved doing this, where he takes the stage by himself. And he either sits at piano or organ or with guitar, and it's just him and an instrument, and he talks and sings. And my friend said, what I'm afraid of is that there's going to be young musicians in the audience who think that that's how you do it. No. Your average musician couldn't get away with that. You've got to be an extraordinary musician to be able to pull that off every night and hold 14,000 people captive. Just you playing whatever you feel like playing, singing whatever you feel like singing. Yeah, lesser musicians, don't try. Don't try that at home.
Amazing. So we'll move on to a few questions that have been sent in. So Gemma, she does ask that, about the influence of musical choices as adults and stuff. But she's bought the book. She can't wait to read it. So I think the book does, so well in kind of answering those questions. But she also talks about her track Paisley Park and how it grabbed her attention above all the other chart music, as a 12-year-old girl, that she felt musically and not lyrically. So that as a child, if you can talk about kind of the relationship with music, young children and their relationship with music.
That's a wonderful thing, and it's not given enough credit. So record makers know this. If you should be so lucky as to have children like your record, you're gold. Especially if it's toddlers, because little toddlers don't know enough to know what a record symbolizes. And all they know, they have no agenda. They're not trying to impress people. All they know is whether or not it works for them. And it might be the rhythm, or it might be the melody, something about it that strikes them as being perfect. But little children actually can predict a lot of hits in some cases, especially that music which is happy and uplifting. So that applies to young people as well, the preteens. The preteen years and our teenage years are when we're most likely to bond to music. And if we just so happen to hear something that strikes us as being perfect for us, matches our listener profile, we will often bond to that artist. That artist is representing someone who's expressing some aspect of ourselves that is true of us. And it could be sexuality, or it could be a certain boldness, or it could be a cleverness, or something about it that that artist is saying that makes you think, down deep inside, that's me. That's me down deep inside, some aspect of this artist. That's what causes that intimate bonding. That is a really wonderful song, Paisley Park. And Prince was influenced by the Beatles then. His girlfriend, Susanna Melvoin, turned him on to the Beatles and Led Zeppelin right around that time. And he was influenced by that.
Brilliant. I mean, I'm trying to put a little track list together, you know, to actually share Prince's music. So when I go into schools and stuff, like Starfish and Coffee and, you know, Paisley Parker, you know, two of them, you know, that really stand out. And then I think lastly, we've got Bernice, who's, you know, said, thank you for a fascinating conversation. She's going to be looking the book up, and she's a Prince fan, an avid Prince fan. We also mentioned about Tevin Campbell. Is there anything you can say about how and why Can We Talk works in terms of its musicality?
Produced, co-written by the great Al B. Sure and his cousin Kyle West. Brilliant arrangers, brilliant with getting those melodies to swim like dolphins around each other, brilliant at knowing how to lay down a foundation, a rhythm, a scaffold to support melody and counter melody, and brilliant at knowing how to frame Tevin Campbell's voice, just like Quincy Jones was with Michael Jackson. When you've got a voice like that with that much power, you got to be careful, because you want what's surrounding that vocal to be as strong as the vocal. So you don't want the vocal to overpower the track, but you don't want it to be so strong that it overpowers the vocal. So people who arranged and wrote for people like Whitney Houston or Tevin Campbell or any of the great, great singers had to have an expert's ear for arrangement, as Al B. Sure and Tevin Campbell and Kyle West certainly did. I love listening to that record that I worked on with them today, because it just kills me how great it is.
And Gil asks, what influences our interest in music as a child? Do you think the removal of music in schools will have a detrimental consequence?
Second question first. The answer is yes, big yes. Children taking music lessons, there's a boatload of evidence about this. Children taking music lessons, and it can be group lessons as well, show improved auditory memory, improved auditory attention. They show improved empathy scores. They show more pro-social behaviors compared to art and sport. When you make music with people, you have to look at them, because you have to synchronize your body's movements to their movements. So group music lessons, just the little things you do when you're a kid in school, is beneficial, and private music lessons even better. So the first part of the question is, what influences you when you're a child musically? Well, as we said, the whole brain is always working. So especially if you're young, the whole brain is processing stimuli. And let's imagine that you're in the back seat of the car, you're with your family, and you're going on a family vacation, or you're going to some happy place that you really are excited to go to, and you're sitting in the back seat and you're 4 years old and the radio is on and you feel great. You're with your family, this is gonna be fun. And a song comes on the radio that sounds like you feel. You're gonna link that pattern of neural activity to those endorphins and those feel-good neurotransmitters that are floating through your body. What's actually happening in that moment, just a little bit, is your auditory cortex that processes sound is getting shaped to be more receptive to that music. So the stimuli, the food, the clothes, TV, the books, the music you hear as a child, you're sifting through all of it. If you happen to encounter it at a time when you already feel good, the odds are good that you're going to form the connection between that style of art or food or whatever and feeling good. And it's going to start you on the road to liking that type of music. Now, this is going to change pretty rapidly when you get into high school and middle school. That time is when you have to show to others what tribe you belong to. And we use our music choices in large part to let the other kids know, this is the kind of kid I am. This is what I'm into. Yeah, when I was a kid in high school, I was just remembering this with in this radio interview I did yesterday. And I was remembering that in high school, the kids that I hung out with were of three camps, depending on who your favorite guitarist was. It was either Jimmy Page,
Okay.
Eric Clapton, or Jeff Beck. It was one of those three. The Jeff Beck kids were considered to be kind of the jazzers. The Eric Clapton kids were the blues kids. I was one of the Jimmy Page kids. But yeah, you hung out with people who shared your taste in music. This is socially rewarding to us, so that music becomes even more socially rewarding to us. It's the music of us.
Fantastic, superb. So on that note, we're going to come to a close. So please check out the book. I'm so looking forward to actually reading it again, because like you said at the beginning, I've actually had more questions come out whilst I've been reading it, and I've got so many other tabs open, things that I'm researching and kind of exploring. So it's super exciting. And again, I was reading it for the interview, but I want to go back and read it for myself and, understand my own listening profile much more. So thank you very much for that. And if all the other participants can have a little look at the Huddersfield Literature Festival, it's on until the 2nd of April, and we've still got lots of exciting things. But yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Susan, for your time.
Thank you so much, Hardy. And I see the fish behind you. You told me before we came on that they haven't had their supper yet, so they want to be fed.
Yeah, they need to be fed as well. And yeah, I need to go walk the dog as well. So
oh, yeah. Okay.
Busy evening. So but thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'll hopefully hear from you soon and the other exciting stuff you're working on. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation. Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming. Bye.
Bye.